Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so very much for joining the UTK Africana Studies Program for its 50+ anniversary program. We are excited to be able to join you today to speak about an aspect of the African diaspora. But very importantly, we are elated to be able to join in the celebration of remembering Black pasts and building Black futures, and highlighting what is a program that has been here at the university since 1969. And so as we're meeting today, and we are discussing for our panel, Africa and Pre-Colonial Society, Unlearning the Myths about the People and the Continent, it is important as well to recognize our faculty members who are joining us in this conversation and sharing their knowledge. Again, and what is that knowledge that is helping us today? It is helping us to think about the past and build how we will move forward. Sankofa. With us today, we have one of our faculty members, Dr. Fatuma Guyo, who is a historian of 20th century Africa with a specialization in East African history. Her teaching and research interests lie at the intersection of pre-colonial and colonial history, borderland history, policy history, women and gender history, oral history, and democratization and social change. Dr. Guyo teaches Introduction to African Studies, Africana Studies 235 and 236 courses. As well, we have with us Dr. Elra Radney. Dr. Radney is a lecturer in the Africana Studies Program, and his training and doctoral degree is in African American and African Studies. And his specialized niche includes 4 main topics of intersection: Black political theory, cultural studies, urban study, and Africana philosophy. Dr. Radney's passion is to teach and use Africana studies as a way to empower and encourage students and the world alike to foster positive development in the interest of the African diaspora. He currently teaches the Africana Studies 202 and 236 courses. As well, we have with us Dr. Amadou Sall. Dr. Sall, along with several faculty members, published an article entitled Experiences of Struggling African American Students at a Predominantly White University in Research in Schools. The purpose of this phenomenological study was to obtain first personal accounts of the experience of struggling Black undergraduates in the Southern Flagship State University. The study's findings suggest that faculty should devote greater attention to improving the classroom climate for minority students. In 2001, Dr. Sall received the Excellence in Teaching Award at UTK, and he is a member of Knox County Disproportionate Minority Contact and Confinement Task Force. Again, join me in welcoming our panelists for this afternoon, Dr. Guyo, Dr. Radney, and Dr. Sall. Dr. Guyo?
Thank you, Dr. Nunali, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to our panel. I would like to begin by saying a little bit about the title of Pre-Colonial. Pre-colonial, the term pre-colonial period needs to be explained in this context because it privileges the colonial history and gives the colonial history a view that sees it as more transformative in comparison to pre-colonial changes or pre-colonial history of Africa itself. So then that is the beginning of, I think, what I would like to conceptualize this talk. And Africa as a continent has been prone to a lot of misconception. And I would like to address this by going back to the historiography of Africa. And I would like to quote one of the early people who have written about the history of the world. That is the writing of Hegel. Hegel treated Africa as a continent that lacked what he called consciousness, spirit of consciousness, which translates to the idea that African continent and its people lack the so-called ideals of civilization, according to him. So when he studied the rest of the world, then he neglected Africa as a continent devoid of morality, religion, political institutions. And somehow this justified what we now know as slavery, transatlantic slave trade, colonization, and things like that. But of course, we have to acknowledge that Africa has a rich culture, and Africa is actually one of the diverse places in the world in terms of ethnic languages, in terms of socio-economic institutions, in terms of religious institutions. And the other misconception that I would like to address is that people view Africa as a continent that is hunger stricken, disease stricken. However, what we know of pre-colonial Africa is that pre-colonial Africa is rich in terms of resources. Each part of Africa has actually a mineral. For example, gold in South Africa, gold in West Africa, oil in Sudan. So Africa is rich. And then the other misconception is the idea of lumping together a continent that is very large and actually can fit within it the whole of US, Europe, and some China included, as a continent that is very small. That is how Africa is normally represented. But we know that Africa is large, and all this idea of representation is to rob Africa of its rich past and rich culture. So then in light of this misconception in the early writing of African history, I would like to point out that much of reconstruction of African history began in the 1950s and 1960s. And these were work done by the generation of, the first generation of African scholars. I can name a few of them like the likes of Sheikh Diop, the likes of Jan Vasina. So these people reconstructed the history of Africa, and they restored Africa to its place of prestige that it used to enjoy. So in talking about pre-colonial Africa, we know that Africa is very diverse and large. So I'm going to narrow down my talk to a specific topic. And for today, I'm going to focus on women. Having said, you know, those general myths surrounding Africa, women actually have been considered as one of the people who have been marginalized by African societies. That is another misconception. However, what we know is that African women played a crucial role in their societies from the earliest period. We know that African women participated in agriculture. Agricultural production was one of the important places that women exercised their power. And as we speak, statistics don't lie. And today we know that 80% of Africa's agricultural production is controlled by women. So that is an avenue of power that women control, issues of marketing and things like that. We've seen these issues of gender role addressed by various gender scholars in Africa, the likes of Amadou, who talked about the role of women among West African society. We have the likes of Kumsa Kwe, who talked about the women in Oromo community in Ethiopia. And we have so many of those. So African women have also played an important role in terms of political roles. They wielded roles that ascribed to them as queen mothers, queen sisters, although gender historians might look at those roles as, being ascribed through their husbands. But what we know is that women really participated behind, even if it was role that are considered behind their husband, they participated and offered important advice. And of course, without women, men could not, for example, the kings were not allowed to proceed with the work of ruling over the societies without the blessings of women. And this translates to the larger role that women play in Africa's religion. And that is like a very important very important role. We see pre-colonial women in places like Nubia, for example, playing that spiritual role. Nubia has a lot of women rulers. Nubian women are represented in statues. There are a lot of representation of women through statues that speaks to their powerful role, both as queens, queen mothers. We see also examples of Nubian women actually who are mentioned in some of the pre-colonial writing as warriors who fought even the likes of the Roman Empire. And there is this example where women in Nubian society actually were able to fight the Roman soldiers and brought actually the head of one of the people that they helped to fight. I think these are some of the representation we are normally not told or they are not known. What we often get to hear is that African women are marginalized. And like I said, that is a misconception. And the roots of some of these misconceptions about women issues of power and roles, again, is traced to the period of colonization, where different European powers brought their own gender ideologies. For example, the British came with Victorian ideals in which they applied the concept of gender as understood from the perspective of Europeans to that of Africa, which did not really apply to African societies. And pre-colonial African societies ascribed gender roles to women based on age and seniority. So they had a totally different view of gender, and actually power was not what determined differences in the role of men and women, but rather issues of seniority and issues of age were really important. And we can read this especially the work by Amadou. I would like also to point out that in relation to pre-colonial period, Africa actually is one of the continents that has produced women presidents. And this is really significant because until now, the so-called developed countries like the United States was not able to give women position of power until the recent election of Kamala Harris as the vice president. However, in Africa, we had women presidents like the case of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the president of Liberia from 2006 to 2018. We currently have Sahela Worke Zewedi, the president of Ethiopia. So these are examples of women roles, which we are supposed to view it as continuation from pre-colonial period. The only interruption, of course, was during a colonial period that I've mentioned, where women were affected by colonization. They were displaced from their socioeconomic roles, from religious roles and things like that. We should also add environmental activists, like the case of Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan environmentalist who won a Nobel Prize. And we can go on and mention some of the important roles of women. These are some of the highlights I wanted to mention. I don't know how many minutes I have left.
I'll just say graciously, few, just, yeah, so we can bring in our other colleague as well.
Yeah.
Have you finished, Dr. Guyo?
Yeah, I finished, sorry. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Radney?
I need to set up a short video presentation to set up my talk. Let's see. All right. Can everybody see this video? All right. Yes. Thank you.
Be proud of our heritage. As somebody said earlier tonight, we don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, and clean. But I want to get the language right tonight. I want to get the language so right that everybody here will cry out, yes, I'm black, I'm proud of it, I'm black and beautiful. Believe in yourself and believe.
Okay. All right. Let me close this out here. Okay. So, all right. Can everybody see and hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right. So my discourse on the myths of pre-colonial Africa is rooted in what I refer to via Frantz Fanon as the Manichaean problem. The duality that Martin calls attention to in the video content, the lies that are assigned to Blackness and whiteness, is a reference to the Manichaean problem. Right? Fanon tells us that the colonial world of Africa made by European conquest is a Manichaean world, where the colonizer turns the African colonized subject and his pre-colonial history into the epitome of evil and darkness. So Manichaeanism is negatively racialized or inscribed onto the bodies, souls, and minds of Africa and other peoples of the African diaspora. So this kind of racial branding or color code classification of Africans in Africa made it possible to otherize Africans as the enemy of progress, the enemy of sophisticated human development, and thereby provided easy conscience to further the designs of European imperialism. And this was not the product of European ignorance so much. No, this was the cultivation of an intentional lie. This social Darwinist historical making by Europeans wanted us to believe that something new and better in the modern sense emerged due to their advent of slavery and colonization. This color code inferiority classification of Africa was an escape into irresponsibility where nothing worthy of human advancement could exist. The more the Western world grew rich on the institution of slavery, the more it proclaimed the myth of a single inferior African humanity. Europeans had known quite a lot about Africa for at least 2,000 years before they came to the shores of Africa in the 1500s. However, due to powerful and strategic imperial inclinations, European leaders began purposely ignoring earlier sources of information and evidence. Hence, the dark continent descriptive of Africa was a fabricated hypothesis to explain away the growing evidence of modern African societies and civilization. This dark continent thesis was first backed up from a biblical myth of the Hermetic hypothesis, to false scientific claims via what we call scientific racism. As a main centralizing myth, the Hermetic hypothesis served two major purposes: to justify transatlantic slavery and to historically erase the credit and evidence of original civilization from indigenous Africans. It is the basis of all of the out of Africa or not out of Africa school of Eurocentric thought. And alongside this arose a culture of disbelief of African accomplishments, often accompanied by European interpreters who saw African accomplishments as spearheaded by extraterrestrials or outsiders or settlers. In 1787, Count Constantine Boney speaks to the roots of this disbelief practice when he explains or exclaims, "Just think that this race of Black men, today our slave and the object of our scorn, is the very race to which we owe our arts, sciences, and even the use of speech." So during the 18th century, three factors, which included the intensification of the Atlantic slave trade, the increased economic and cultural integration of plantation societies into European society, and the growing currency of European Enlightenment notions of human progress, produced a conventional image of Africa in the Western imagination as a primitive and pagan place. Africans, according to this dark continent view, were a savage people who existed pre-modernly and pre-logically outside the narrative of Western progress. Africa then becomes a dark continent because of the primitive mysteries and the so-called savagery Europeans were expected to find in its interior. Hence, this dark continent now possessed a new racialized history, a historical memory replacement which was imbued with the absence of a worthy place in the progressive universal history of humankind. If we had a concept of a dark Africa, being manufactured in all of this transatlantic slavery, rationale-based literature and history writing, then what shade does this bequeath to Europe? The light, of course, right? So what does the light or bringing the light mean or represent in this context? It represents notions of morality, high culture, high-minded thinking, philosophy, intellect, intelligence, the right spirituality, the right religion, the right God, the white God, right? Goodness, upright living, non-backwardness, logic and reasoning, purpose, destiny, progress, and proper human development, among others. This Manichaean fabrication of the pre-colonial world means that the colonized does not just have any positive core values that emerge from their own historical agency or autonomy, but the colonized African is now the very negation of good values. He or she is the enemy of values and philosophy or high learning or ethics or intellectual and spiritual sophistication. This Manichaean problem goes further to implicate the colonized African in zoological terms, or more animal than human, thus a problem of evolution known as the savage. Africa's wild, and he or she is this product of the wild man, the wild woman, the primitive who is far beyond the light of decent human development. This reconstruction of African humanity makes them into a corrupting force, like their voodoo and their pagan gods that must be stamped out. In this way, the Manichaean problem assigns a fixed duality as an organizational and exploitative strategy that decrees and equates European whiteness with purity and goodness, and designates and equates African Blackness with impurity and evil. Even when Africans were on the right side of history, defending and fighting against colonization and slavery, such as Queen Nzimba Mndimbi of the Mbundu kingdoms of Ndongo and Mtambi during the 15th to 16th century, located in present-day Angola, who fought against Portuguese imperialism. We were all possibly indoctrinated or convinced that they were the villains and the enemies. Just like we were convinced to not root for the Native Americans in old cowboy or Western movies. Thus, the colonized African subject in Africa and the African diaspora, I might add, learns to equate through this indoctrination their original African selves before the troubled encounter with Europeans with shame and condemnation. This has profound psychological repercussions on the psyche of Africans and all Afro peoples in the diaspora. This results in a sense of alienation from other Africans in the diaspora. So in its strategy, the Manichaean imposition through mental trickery or psychic manipulation sought to persuade the colonized that colonization and slavery was actually beneficial to them rather than destructive to them. The Emetic hypotheses and the Manichaean problem working together claim that whatever there was organized state life and high society of culture, these ideas must have come from elsewhere, out of Africa, because Africans were allegedly not capable of such human development or civilization. The Europeans' desire to legitimize colonization and the slave trade undertook an entire body of historical and philosophical literature, a white superiority epistemic, to describe the so-called inferior traits of the Black. Negro, African, henceforth became synonymous with a primitive being, inferior, endowed only with a pre-logical and pre-modern mentality and faculties. The mind of several generations of Europeans and others would be indoctrinated to accept as revealed truth the equation African Negro equals inferiority and intellect, inferior humanity and intellect, rather. This colonization would appear as the duty of white humanity. Rudyard Kipling, right, among others, invoked the white man's civilization burden as an edict of civilizing mission, charged with the responsibility to raise the African to the level of other men. From then on, Western racial capitalism had clear sailing to practice the most ferocious human exploitation under the cloak of moral pretext.
It's 6 o'clock.
This biblical myth of the Hamitic curse meant that the enslavement of Africans and their descendants were preordained from God himself. So Africans or Negroes could be degraded while remaining a part of humanity without disturbing Christian sensibilities, you see. This Hamitic assignment of African humanity imbues it with being cursed. Under this permission, Europeans and others could continue to condemn being Black or of African origin. European concepts of modernity, logic, and enlightenment created a fixed global status for the African. The myth of inherited slave status and the myth of inherited savage status, which was a product of combining Black or African skin to pagan faith. Africans essentially had no souls and did not have a decent understanding and access to God, the white God. This soulless and blank slate construction was advanced onto and into the bodies of Africans in Portuguese possession in the 15th century. So the historical evidence points to the fact that white European historical writing has thus been complicit with colonization, slavery, and imperialism. So racialized Manichaeanism doesn't just foster the colonized mind. It also fabricates a distortion of what Africa really is in its pre-colonial historical image and historical dignity, right? So this deeply offensive typing of Africa as pre-modern or primitive and as non-recorded history and thus not cognitively developed in this high-minded way has been sustained and vigorous in its life of fallacies. So I think, and finishing up here, I think we must also begin to think about this in terms of a psycho-historical analysis, right? What is the impact of Europeans rewriting and erasing African historical dignity on the state of the African world and the African mind in the world? It then becomes more and more apparent that the process towards psychological integrity then requires us to steer a corrective course, a path towards getting the language right, as Martin tells us, that continues to debunk several myths, such as the notion that African cultures and societies serve as an example of how human beings lived before recorded history needs to be dismissed. The characteristic of Africa's pre-colonial indigenous cultures and societies as significantly ahistorical or pre-modern needs to be dismissed. The significance of the word primitive by non-African typing or describing African cultures and societies needs to be dismissed. That African philosophy does not rival, is not similar, or gave birth to European philosophy needs to be dismissed. In ending, let us be reminded by what Dr. John Arnold Clark asserts, that civilization emerged first on the African continent, and all other continents are the inheritors of those first humans who occupied that African landmass. That's all I got.
Thank you, Dr. Radney. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Sall.
Yes. I want to start by just telling my own story in high school. And I think what happened to me is we were in a history class at that time when I was in high school. And this is a professor from France telling us some history of European history. And I told him, I said, listen, can you tell us the history of Africa? And he asked me to get out, to go, to leave the class. I said, no, I'm not leaving the class. This is my country. You came here, you live. This is my country. I'm not leaving the class. So he went to see the director of the high school. By the time he left, I left the class. And then the director asked me to bring my dad at the school. So I just met another Fulani like myself, and I asked him to, because I would never bring my dad to school. So I asked somebody else to come, speak Fulani like me, to come with me to see the director. And we went there. And the director was telling him about what I did and so forth. And this guy was trying to hit me at the time. I said, no, I don't think that's part of it. So just to say that the African history have been taught, even in Africa, from European perspective. And even today, I think it's now that we are start talking about, as scholars, to think about decolonizing way of knowing, decolonizing knowledge, which means we have to tell our own story. Because if you let somebody else do it, and that's what happened, they tell the story from their own perspective. And so to just talk about pre-colonial Africa, we know now through science that anybody, any living human on Earth today can trace their lineage back to Africa because of one mitochondrial DNA that survived from this Black woman in Africa 150 years ago. So anybody, it doesn't matter what the skin color or where you live in Asia, Africa, Europe, it doesn't make a difference. You take that DNA, and if you are white, tell them that you want to know where you came from in Africa, and they will tell you which ethnic group today you came from. I have a student in my class who told us about her ancestors in Africa being in Cameroon and some other places. So I think that's the first thing. And Sheikh Anta Diop, who did a lot of work about Egypt, but also the evolution of mankind, have told us in 1973 on an article that science will one day prove that we all came from Africa. And prior to him, we have Charles Darwin, who talked about in his book in 1871 that we came from apes in Africa. It was dismissed, but today, scientifically is now accepted that we all came from the continent of Africa. Whether we like it or not, that's the reality of it. Whether you tell the story as it is or not, now it's proven by science that we all came from there. The other day, showing a film to my students about the last hominin that have been found in Chad. And that's in 2001, I think, or 11. The skull of that skeleton is in Senegal at this new museum called African Civilization Museum. That's where it is, the real skull. And so with that, the DNA now proves everybody comes from there. But also Egypt. Europeans have always tried to take Egypt out of Africa by Egyptians who are not Africans. And you will know that all the pharaohs were Black. And also we know that everything we know today in science has been proven came from Egypt itself. Whether it's a medicine, Imhotep, who was a genius, have done a lot of surgeries, eye surgeries, head surgeries, all kinds of surgeries. Even diabetes at the time also was happening there. So it has been proven now. It's no longer something people can deny that we didn't come all over come from Africa. It's about who's telling the story, who's writing those history books. And that is where we need to bring back in terms of history books, who's writing them and why is it anybody who's been involved in talking about the history books, you write it from the perspective of the winners. And the dark continent, that came from Friedrich Hegel from Germany, a philosopher who is the one who labeled Africa as a dark continent, saying that we have no history, and so we shouldn't be worried about Africa itself. But yet, nowadays, we have proof that we all came from there. It's a matter of now teaching the real history itself. Being a Fulani myself, and knowing that we have a long history when it's come to African history itself. We are pastoralists, we moved around a lot. We are one of the biggest ethnic group in Africa, but also the most spread ethnic in Africa itself. And we also fought the French when they started coming to West Africa. We are the first Fulani that fought the French when they're trying to get through the River Senegal into the interior of West Africa itself. People like El Hadj Omar Tall, people don't know him, but we do know who that person is and how he fought Faidherbe, who was at that time the governor of West Africa. We have Ousmane Dan Fodio in Nigeria. We have also the Fouta Djallon. And all of that, they used Islam at the same time to fight those Europeans, the French, in West Africa itself. So, and when we talked about skin color, because that's the main thing that Europeans have used to make us less than a human. But the reality is, nowadays it have shown that everybody came from Africa, we were all Black. And Cheikh Anta Diop said, if Black people didn't go out of Africa, there wouldn't be white people, there wouldn't be yellow people, there wouldn't be red people at all. Everybody would have been Black. And then you have this professor in Holland, I think, who was trying to teach about skin color, found out that in order for somebody who left Africa as a dark person, it will take you 20,000 years to go from Black to white, according to the environment you lived in. And that pigmentation that we have, the melanin, is as important as being white in places where you don't have UV. So in the tropics, we need vitamin D, just like anybody else on Earth, coming from UV in order for us to survive. So being in the tropics, we have to be dark to get the same amount of vitamin D in our bodies through UV as somebody in Norway who's like cheese-like skin to get the same amount of vitamin D in their skin. And so when you go from the equator to the north, you can see the changes of color of human beings because of that. And that story, even though Europeans knew about it, they never told us about it. And of course, with racism coming with transatlantic slave trade, they have no reason to do so. And I ask my students if they know the history of Native Americans in the United States, in the Americas. Absolutely none, because it's never taught in schools at all, anywhere in the schools. So, which means those people, it's like they never had a history in the first place, even though they are here in the United States. And why is that? Again, it's all about power and privilege. And if you have that power, you want to keep it. And to keep it is not to tell the truth about history. Because if that history was taught, the real history that now we're doing now, hopefully with our program and department soon, is to show that we are all human beings. We breathe the same air. It doesn't matter, rich, poor, Black, yellow, it doesn't make a difference. If we drink a polluted water, everybody will be affected by it. And so it's when we get to that level, when we know that we are all coming from Africa, we are all human beings, maybe this idea of superiority using skin color may go away because we will see each other as just human beings, nothing else. And for post-colonial era today, I tell my students to go and check TED Talk to see what young people today in Africa are doing. They don't use the technology just as a consumer. They use it as also to create things for themselves, to solve problems in their own communities. And that's important for us to go back into history go back to prehistory, to talk about who are we, how we evolve as human beings. Languages. Europeans have said we don't have written languages, and yet Egypt was one of the first people to use written language. That's how we knew all the things they gave us calendar, science, everything was written down. And that's how we got to know what it is, what they gave us. But we never acknowledged that as African gave us everything we got today. I mean, in terms of, people may call European as creating, inventing stuff, but none of those things, even agriculture tools, started in Africa when we started farming. And Egyptian gave us all the science we are using today. And I think that's important, to put people at the equal level, to see each other just as human beings, and to get away with all these divisions. In the 21st century, we still have racism going on. We still have people not being taken care of. Those inequalities, whether it's access to school, access to healthcare, all of those things is there. And I think for Africa now, what we are going to is to use our languages to develop ourselves, because no country on earth have been developed in somebody else's language. It's only us that Europeans are telling us we have to use their languages to develop. And yet we are the richest continent on earth. Whatever minerals you said, we have it. Whatever make our electronic work today, we have it. That's mica, that's coltan, those we have it. If tomorrow we just said, okay, guys, no more natural resources from Africa, that's be it for the world. They're getting it cheap from us, exploiting today people who are digging for the coltan in Congo, who are not getting anything out of it. The middlemen get a lot of it. And of course, the rest of the industry. But one thing is changing, like Botswana is one of the richest countries when it's come to diamonds. They used to sell raw diamonds because they're making money. But now they are training people in Botswana to cut the diamonds, because that's an added value, because you create jobs at the same time. And that is, I think, some of the changes. But we need to get that information, especially Africa before history itself, prehistory. And one more thing before I stop is that religion, the notion of one God, came from Egypt with a pharaoh called Akhenaten. That's where it came from. The monotheism came from that. Anybody who read their Bibles will hear names of Egypt, Cush. Those names are there, pharaohs. That's in Africa. Niles with Moses, that's in Africa. But yet people, when they read their Bible, they don't make those connections with Africa itself. And that's just, I think it's important to talk about the past as much as the present in order to deal with all this nonsense about people being inferior, being superior, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sall, and thank you to all of our panelists. We would now like to open the floor for questions in the chat. And I can start us off. As we've been thinking about pre-colonial Africa, could you comment more about how we got to this point within our conversations about the study of the continent to actually be conscious about pre-colonial society and what that meant for Africa?
Is it for me?
Open to the panel.
Oh, okay. Well, let me just answer some of that. I think African scholars, and thanks to Gaddafi at the time, they went to UNESCO wanted to write the history of Africa, pre-colonial and colonial and after colonial time by UNESCO. And we had 8 volumes of African history written by African historians themselves. And we have that volume at UT, the whole volume, 8 volumes of that. And I think that was the consciousness that came after independence. Before that, we didn't have much of scholars. Even we do have scholars, but they didn't have much of a power at that time to bring that up. But after the independence, I think that was something that changed when they went to UNESCO. And also we had a director of UNESCO from Senegal. His name was Amadou Sall. And I think that also helped with that, having that, the historian themselves throughout Africa to write that, the history of Africa itself. And today, BBC News, they have this series of documentaries based on the volumes, the African history that was done by UNESCO. And I'm using some of those in my classes.
I can add to that. Actually, we need to break down what we mean when we talk of African past or African pre-colonial period. And it refers to not only the written records, but also to the arts, culture, deeds, and events of African people. And like most of my colleagues have mentioned, this span the time period of the earliest, which is the beginning of human origin, until the modern period. So for me, I think we need to go beyond the written document, and many scholars on Africa have generally agreed that the past about Africa is actually hidden in unwritten sources. And in my class, I found out that talking about these change student perspectives in ways that we never thought about before, like dissecting a piece of art or showing a piece of pottery can really tell a lot about African societies. Or even the word pre-colonial, I think we can broaden that to include all those rich interdisciplinary materials, which I think is core value of our program here.
Dr. Radney, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, I just like to say, and this is something Fatuma, Dr. Guyo alluded to earlier, in the 1950s, there was an age of awakening, right? And scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop, like Dr. Sall talked about, Cheikh Anta Diop, Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of Civilization, and there were other scholars who were writing in an anti-colonial critique, in a way of the anti-colonial framework, right, became a kind of watershed to prove that Africans were not this kind of primitive or Manichaean kind of image that the colonial historical writing had put together to rationalize slavery, right? And I think as well with African Americans, Alex Haley's book, Roots, had a big impact on African Americans wanting to find out what came before slavery, what came before, right? And I think alongside that, with regard to television, you know, not only was Alex Haley televised, but it was Ali Mazrui, complete works on the Africans, which came out in the early 80s. I think for many people, that work was used to introduce people who were not even interested in that pre-colonial history, along with the work of Basil Davison and others, you know. So I think the videography, these video social scientists, as they came together and put these kinds of discourses and these works on video, you know, the old VHS and all that, I think that gave a chance to a lot of us from the laymen and larger communities to kind of like to pique that interest. And we all start wanting to like say, okay, let me find out what Africa was really about, right, in these pre-colonial times, right, in contrast to this idea of the Tarzan myths of pre-colonial Africa. the Rudyard Kipling myths of pre-colonial Africa, the Edgar Rice Burroughs, the whole jungle safari narrative that we have been inundated with, well, I was, growing up as a child. And what that kind of stuff is still out there. And of course, that kind of narrative still exists. And especially with Disney's investment in like the Lion King. And I always say, well, there's a real Lion King, right? Sunyata, right? So why not just make the movie about him as opposed to making a movie about like animals, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think those kind of like three elements played a great part in this appeal, this interest of the pre-colonial African society.
Dr. Radney, you said something very important, and that is for us to recognize that these myths are still with us. While we speak of what was a creation of them, right, it is that they have a presence today. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering if each of you could comment on what that presence is today. And for that much, I just realized it may even be important to discuss, even briefly, although I understand that this could be another conversation of itself, and that is colonialism. Right? We assume in an age now, there are conversations about nations on the continent, but that what colonialism meant was something different in history. And what did that mean for the continent and the nations that we see today?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is still with us and actually has been more highlighted even today, more than ever by technology, is the stereotype through the media. And I think media plays a huge role still on how Africa is represented. And but then on the positive side, we have a generation of African, not necessarily scholars, but generation of Africans who are really into technology, that are telling the story of Africa from another perspective, that show or speak to the idea that African people, like any other culture, they do everyday things, how they live, how they live. And we can all attest to that those are kind of images that we need to counter the single narrative case, where we see like a lot of photos that shows Africa's mega cities like Nairobi, for example, East Africa, the hub of Kenya. It's showing other development in other parts of Africa. It's showing the infrastructures, buildings. So Africa is not all about savannas and lions and all those, but African people are living everyday life. So I think technology has somehow helped us to dispel the myth of Africa, but then at the same time, it has also enhanced, because now it's very easy to share anything through technology. The images that we see, the images of hungry children, or the images of people who are sick and things like that. Yeah, that is what I wanted to add. But in terms of colonial period or colonization, colonial period itself was an epoch in African history that marginalizes the society. And today I was talking about the role of explorers, the role of missionary writings. And I think one of the very first images of Africa that showcased Africa in a negative way were shared by even like missionaries, the likes of David Livingstone. You know, he depicted Africa as poor. He opened Africa to British colonization. So then these myths have origin during slavery. But then I think the impact was really felt during colonization.
Yeah.
Dr. Ray?
Oh yeah, I was just going to kind of like somewhat piggyback off what a guy was. I think it's the single narrative piece is crucial. Like what who is it? Dr. Chidamani Adichie calls it the danger of the single story. It's these dangerous single narratives of Africa being this place of constant deficit, and that they're Black deficit, Black born deficit, Black self-inflicted deficit. And that's a colonial narrative that continues in its neo-colonial expression, and right, and that there's no prosperity in Africa. You know, there's no Lagos and other kinds of, you know, built up cities. And I think one of the best critiques of that is to look to is the filmmakers. The filmmakers that come like Ousmane Simbimbi's. When you look at his Black girl, when he's taking this Senegalese woman who thinks about going to Paris and France as if it's something better, right? And she wants to be this French, you know, made woman, right? And so she accepts this job as a domestic. And when she gets there, her employers employ her as a slave. And so she ends up killing herself. And Simbembe is telling us is that, like Fanon is telling us, psychologically, we're trying to find our validation through these colonial mores, this colonial norm, and that we need to Sankofa, go back and understand how our African heritage, our African ways and perspective can give us a better, healthy, informed, and better future, right? And the Nollywood tradition that comes out of Nigeria, right, has presented all these kind of like counter narratives, right, to how Nigeria is supposed to be always explosive because of the Boko Haram and those kind of things, right? So I think filmmakers play an excellent role in pushing back against this colonial narrative, and also in the sense that the colonial narrative, as it continues to create these kind of like single narrative images of Africa as this self-imposed Black deficit place, and not often entertain or interject how colonization, right? How the European troubled presence started a ripple effect, created these kinds of long minded outcomes that we see to this day, right? And so that's my perspective.
For me, I think I want to say that in terms of colonial powers, when they came to Africa, according to Sheikh Anta Diop, there are two factors that they took away from us: linguistic factor and the historical factor. And today, you go to Africa, we all, you know, I was trained in French, but nothing in Pular, in Fulani, for instance. And I think now Africans are coming to recognize that we have to go back to our roots. We have to use those languages. Science is universal. We cannot let Europeans telling us, that's what they did during the colonial time by saying that we cannot use our languages to be developed. That was taken away from us. So you go to universities in Africa today, they have a department of English department, for instance, in some places, but they don't have the African languages department. In South Africa, they do, because that's most recent independent country with Nelson Mandela. So the kids going to school, the four years they go to school, elementary school, the first 4 years, they do it in their own languages. And then they choose between English and Afrikaans. So Africans are starting asking those questions. We need to expand and also use our languages. If you're making a tablet, you can make it in any language you want to. We have written languages. And I think that is coming. And one thing just more recent, it's not even 2 months ago, that the French Radio International have opened a station in Senegal. And that radio is all Fulani. There's nothing in it except Fulani, which means they're dealing, or at least they're catching up about 50 million people, because we are the only ethnic group that speak a language that almost 50 million people speak as an ethnic group. Swahili in East Africa is not an ethnic group, it's just a language. It's a Bantu plus Arab mix. And so they saw that necessity to have this station, radio station in Pular, we call it Fulfulde, for that whole region in West Africa. So people are taking notes that we can be developed by using our languages. And we cannot neglect our languages. Here in Tennessee, for instance, we don't have at the University of Tennessee, or few universities have African languages being taught at the university level. And yet, we're a market for United States. So during the time with Kennedy, we have all these Peace Corps people. When they come, they learn the language. And I'm using some of that they wrote about how the English Pular language they have put together in here. So going back to our languages in the first place, I think is important. And that's also to show that we have languages that you can use to develop, just like the Chinese use Mandarin for their development, and the Japanese. And I think until Africans start doing that kind of things and showing that without our resources, none of these countries in Europe would be developed. And also even with energy, for instance, now we're learning that we have a lot of sun in Africa. We have a lot of desert. I mean, why don't we start thinking about solar energy in anything we do? We can create those things in Africa. We don't have to wait for the European to do it, because they will never do it. And so again, all of those things will come to Africans themselves being conscious about the way we have been treated, how we have been exploited for a long time. And now it's time to change that one-way exploitations. Has to be a change where we respect each other, and also using the past, especially during colonial time, to learn for the future, for the African future, to make those changes.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sall, because I think you were spot on with the question that we had initially in the chat, and I recognize that question. Do you feel that discarding the language imposed by the colonists, for example, changing the name of the country from Kingdom of Swaziland to the Kingdom of Eswatini, will enhance the sharing of the pre-colonial history and what was lost due to colonialism?
I think that started already for some countries. Burkina Faso used to be Upper Volta. They changed it to Burkina Faso. Mauritania, it's also was a kingdom in Africa itself. So they just took that kingdom and gave us that name. Ghana, for instance, was ancient Ghana that Kwame Nkrumah have used for that name, ancient Ghana. So you use it Ghana because I have nothing to do with ancient Ghana, which is far away from where Ghana is today. There was Ashanti Kingdom there, but not Ghana. He named it Ghana after the independence. So I think people are start thinking about those stuff, changing it. But also we don't want to say just, we don't care about, we want to just cut off with the West. No, we can keep what we want to keep, but we have to make those choices. The Africa state, for instance, used to be Kwame Nkrumah's idea, because he was the first, Ghana was the first independent country. It was called Gold Coast by the British. And when he went to UN, he was the advocate of the independence of Africa itself, because he got the independence in 1957. And that's when he got Ghana name for the Gold Coast. And also the idea of having one country as Africa now is coming back in the discussion since we have African Union. People are talking about that. Most recently, they passed I think, a declaration saying that we need to have one passport, and that is happening. It's just a matter of each country with their system to accept that, so that everybody in Africa will have one passport, just like Europe. We have these different regions, but again, that's what is coming up right now in terms of the names itself. But we don't want to just say, okay, we don't have nothing to do with Europe, because again, we are connected. But at the same time, it has to be our choices, what we want to do with ourselves, naming countries or renaming them, those kind of things, rather than somebody else telling us what to do. And people will get mad about, well, you guys, you never know what country is because they change names all the time. So what? We make those changes. And that's appropriate for us. Now, if somebody want to keep their name of the country, that should be fine. But at the same time, some people at least are making those discussions to see if we need to. And even getting rid of those borders, I think with some of the organizations they have five groups in Senegal, in Africa, and each of them, you can move from one place to another without being asked IDs, which is a good start. So those frontiers were just made arbitrary from Europeans. Mauritania and Senegal is divided by the River Senegal, which was the same people in both sides. So I think those are coming up in terms of, we're not rejecting everything about West, but it has to be on our own terms.
Yeah. Very quickly, I want to add something. While I recognize the importance of changing name, I think it's also important to think about changes that are needed in institutional framework and practices, because looking at the impact of colonization on Africa, most of it is on the institutional framework and practices. So that's what I wanted to add. And then I want to acknowledge that also, apart from the Fulanis being ethnic languages spoken, there are other examples also. As Dr. Sall has mentioned, we have the case of Somalia, which is ethnic language. We have the case of Oromo, actually is one of the largest ethnic groups also in Ethiopia. And the fact that Kiswahili is actually a regional language as opposed to ethnic language, because it's spoken by Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, part of Central Africa, and actually some part of South Africa, like Mozambique. So I just wanted to add to what Dr. Sall said.
And we have time for one question, which I see is coming from our colleague, Dr. Kbense. This question is for Dr. Sall. You mentioned that monotheism began in Egypt under the rule of Akhenaten, and that Egypt is mentioned throughout the Bible. Why do you think Egypt is discussed with such disdain in the Bible, even though, as you suggest, monotheism began there? I appreciate your discussion regarding monotheism being first practiced in Egypt. This is not often discussed.
Well, Christianity was already, I think, in Africa before European came in.
Right.
So you have the Romans. No, the Greeks came first in Egypt, because they didn't go really into interior of Africa. So when the Greeks came to Egypt, Christianity were already there. And then later the Romans came and kicked out the Romans out of Egypt, kicked out the Greeks out of Egypt. And the Romans didn't just stay in Egypt, they went also through Morocco, Tunisia, and so forth. And then later in the 7th century, you have the Arabs came in and they took over Romans and kicked them out of Egypt itself. So if you look at Ethiopia, Christianity in Ethiopia, for instance, just like in Egypt, because you have the Coptic Church in Egypt a long time ago. You have also different denomination all the way to what we call today Morocco and over there in that sense. So all of that came before Egypt. Remember, Moses was born in Egypt himself.
Right.
Well, he was an African Jew, what we call it.
Right.
And so during that period of time, with everything going on with Christianity was already there in Egypt, and also what we call the Orthodox Christians in Ethiopia, over there.
Right.
So I don't know if that responds to the question or not.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sall. And everyone, actually, that is right on time with what is the end of our program this evening. And I sincerely wish to thank the International House, which is our co-sponsor for our event. And thank you as well, Evan Oliver, for your outreach to us and brokering what is this partnership. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Hopefully you learned something more about Africa and helping to dispel the myths that have been common in our knowledge about what Africa is as a continent. Thank you very much and have a good evening. And thank you very much to our panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
We appreciate you.
See ya.
See you guys.
Good one.
Yep.